Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 139, Starting as They Mean to Go On. This podcast is recorded in Te Whanganui a Tara, on the rohe of Muiupoko, Taranaki Whanui, Te Atiawa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira. We are generously supported by our amazing patrons, such as Violet. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/historyaotearoa. Last time, we discussed the early career of Jean-Francois-Marie de Surville, the explorer that would be the next European to reach Aotearoa, as well as how he and his mates, the governors of Pondicherry and Chandernagore, set up a syndicate with the intention of making an expedition to somewhere. They didn't really tell anyone where they were actually going, not even First Lieutenant Guillaume l'Abbé. As we talked about last time, l'Abbé was the second in command of the expedition, with de Surville as commander. And now that the voyage is about to get underway, it's a good time to introduce some of the other characters aboard the St Jean Baptiste. Other officers on the crew were Jean Potier de la Horme and René Charenton as second lieutenants, which was one rank below l'Abbé, and Paul Monneron as clerk, the man who l'Abbé met in Chevalier's palace and was a well-connected, if young, businessman. We will be hearing a lot from Potier and Monneron, as well as de Surville and l'Abbé going forward, as they all kept their own individual journals on the expedition, which is a welcome difference to Tasman's, where there was only one official journal and a couple of illegal ones. As an officer of the same rank as Potier, I assume that Charenton also kept a journal, but none of the sources that I read seemed to reference it, so presumably it didn't survive. He also doesn't seem to do anything terribly significant during the voyage, at least compared to Potier, so this is pretty much the only time we're going to mention him. As well as these officers, there was a Dominican priest, Father Paul-Antoine Léonard de Villefix, to act as chaplain, and as an ensign was de Surville's nephew, Jean-Marie, the son of his late brother, Louis, who died in the 7 Years' War when he and his brother served in the same fleet. Other than that, all the usual positions were there, such as a barber-surgeon, Pierre Deluc, carpenters, caulkers, cooks, and all of that. In terms of nationalities, there was a wide variety of people on board the ship. Obviously Frenchmen, but also Gallic-speaking Bretons, one German, some Indian-born Portuguese, and about 30 Indians of varying religious persuasions, such as Christian, Hindu, and Muslim. Additionally, there were some black slaves from Mauritius and Madagascar. Amongst the sailors were 24 soldiers from the French India Battalion, which was similar to the Marines in the British Royal Navy. They were led by a captain, a sergeant, 2 corporals, a fifer, and a drummer. Monneron states in his journal that the soldiers were there to deter outside threats, which I found interesting, as that is the opposite of Abel Tasman's voyage, where his soldiers were meant to be a deterrent to his own crew against mutiny. Between the soldiers, officers, and the crew, in total, there were 172 souls on this expedition. Of course, all of these people weren't doing this for free. So, let's talk about money. And I can hear your eyes rolling in your head right now and you're thinking this is going to be super boring, but I promise it's not. This is actually really interesting. The reason it's interesting is because the cost of the expedition was absolutely enormous. 2.5 to 3 million livres, depending on the source you read, which is about 125 to 150,000 British pounds at the time. Of course, this probably doesn't mean much to you, since these numbers are in a different currency that most of you won't be terribly familiar with, and perhaps more importantly, they're from the 1760s and don't account for inflation. Instead, historian John Dunmore makes it a bit easier for us to understand by putting it in the context of the wage Labe was paid. Including the stipend paid to his wife, Labe received £300 sterling a year. We know that Labe was the rank of first lieutenant, so we can compare that with a person on a ship in a similar position today and see what they would be paid. As you might expect, due to inflation, it is a much larger number. But once we know that, we can then take that number and use it to estimate the entire value of the expedition in modern dollars. At a rough estimate, Dunmore says the cost of the St Jean Baptiste expedition would easily exceed 1 million New Zealand dollars. However, the caveat with that is he was writing in the late 1960s. So if we want to get it to 2024 dollars, we need to account for inflation from there. If we do that, then de Surville's voyage comes out at an absolutely eye-watering 20 million New Zealand dollars. Which, to be fair, included the cost of building the entire ship, the crew's wages, and their supplies. For comparison, Cook's first voyage cost £10,000, or approximately $2 million today. And this is where things get even more interesting, because the French were spending 10 to 15 times more for a comparable expedition that occurred at exactly the same time. So with that in mind, we would typically expect them to cost roughly the same. So why don't they? Now, the obvious answer is that de Surville had to pay for the construction of a brand new ship, and Cook didn't. And there is an element of that obviously makes his expedition more expensive. However, even if we set that aside, the French expedition is still a lot more expensive. When delving into it deeper, scholars found that the two ships were actually outfitted in a fairly similar manner, meaning the difference didn't come from there. Instead, the increased cost was from the St Jean Baptiste's trade goods. They had iron bars, coloured fabrics, metal tools, and things like that, which was pretty normal. If they were expecting to meet any tribal peoples along the way, Europeans were well aware that these were the sorts of items they were keen to trade for. Tasman also had a similar set of items in 1642. Had this been all that they took, the St Jean Baptiste's cargo wouldn't have been all that noteworthy. But, in addition, they had silk, muslin, carpets from Istanbul, embroidered cloth, alcohol such as port and brandy from France, various spices, and, just for good measure, a shit ton of opium, a hot commodity in Asia at the time. This cargo is unusual because these aren't the sorts of things you take when you think you're going to be trading with people who are subsistence farmers and don't have a culture around metalsmithing. They usually like practical goods, the metal tools and such we mentioned before. These were luxury items that the nobility in Europe often wanted. So, who were these meant to be sold to? A rich noble class of some kind? If so, what were they hoping for in exchange? Gold, jewels, and the like? But perhaps the most important question is, where were they going to find these people? Remember, the expedition was publicly stating to the authorities that they were travelling to China, but very few people knew that wasn't their actual destination, such as Labe, and even less people knew what their true destination was, possibly only de Surville, Governors Lauriston and Chevalier, and potentially Moneron. As far as most people were aware, there wasn't any people in the Pacific who would have precious metals or other high-value items to trade for Ottoman carpets or French brandy. In fact, Moneron throws a bit of shade at the crew, saying that all this expensive stuff wouldn't typically be sold in ports like China, Manila, or Batavia, which he also says they falsely claimed to be going to. As such, it would have been obvious that there was something fishy going on, but I guess no one was paying that close attention. As I mentioned last episode, the reasoning for publicly stating they were travelling to Canton, China, was to stop the secret from getting out about where they were really going. In particular, they were concerned the British authorities might stop them. The hope was that if they said they were going to Canton, the British wouldn't really care, because they had a firm control of the trade in the city. And so it was, on the 3rd of March 1769, the St Jean Baptiste sailed out of Chandernagore and into the Bay of Bengal, totally unimpeded. The Redcoats had seemingly taken the bait. From here, the idea was to sail south and stop off at various ports along the way to pick up supplies, the cargo already mentioned, the soldiers who as yet weren't on board, and any other gear they would need. As they sailed along the Indian coast, Labe got a chance to inspect the ship a bit closer, to see what his home for the next wee while would be like. And he was none too happy with what he saw. The St Jean Baptiste seemed like it was built in a hurry, and as such was not particularly well made. Writing in his journal, quote, "which means there is too much play. Her masts are not supported. The shrouds are close together and get in the way of the guns on the upper deck. Her deck is badly formed with no contours, so that the water cannot run down to the scuppers and lies in the middle of the deck. Her upper and lower spurketings continually gape open." End quote. In other words, the deck wasn't slanted like it should be to make the water slide off the ship, and instead it would pool in the middle. And because the wood planks moved too much, it instead dripped down through the gaps when it bent and shifted, meaning everything below would be damp, potentially ruining their food and trade goods. Not to mention that such a damp atmosphere below deck meant there was an increased likelihood of vermin and disease. Plus, it was just not a pleasant place to be, which was pretty bad, considering the crew would be spending a lot of time in there for God knows how long. The other thing that Labe got to observe, now that they were somewhat underway, was interactions between the crew. He got along well with his direct subordinate, Potier, but Labe was concerned about what was going on between the clerk, Moneron, and de Surville. The captain seemed to hold a lot of confidence in the young man, perhaps even more than he did in Labe. In fact, based on how they talked to one another and how many meetings they had, Moneron seemed to know a lot more about what the fuck was actually going on than Labe did. Which was a bit weird, given Labe was not only second in command, but also an investor. Had Moneron invested too? He was only in his mid-20s at the oldest, so probably not. But his two older brothers were on the Superior Council of Pondicherry, and as such were rather close with Lauriston. perhaps Larbe suspected that Moneron was there to keep an eye on the expedition and look out for the interests of Lauriston and Chevalier. If so, then it was likely Moneron knew more than Larbe did, which he was none too happy about. The first stop on their southward tour of India was Yanam in the region of Andhra Pradesh. Here, de Surville hoped to get fresh water and cattle for his crew. Salted meat was an option, but fresh meat was considered the healthier and more tasty option if possible. However, if you wanted fresh meat before the advent of canning or refrigeration, both of which were decades to a century away, then the only way to get it was to keep it live. Hence the need for cows. When de Surville went ashore, he was dressed in his blue and gold uniform, indicating his rank as a non-noble officer, while the crew lined up on the deck and manned the guns. Once de Surville was in the longboat and being rowed to shore, the crew shouted, "Long live the King!" and Larbe ordered the guns to fire at 1-minute intervals for a 9-gun salute. De Surville stayed in Yanam for a few days, as trading was actually pretty hard there. A potential impending attack from the Maratha Confederacy meant that merchants had shipped most of their stock to an island offshore to keep their wealth safe. This was a problem for de Surville, because he couldn't wait for the goods to be brought from the island. He was on a bit of a time limit. So he purchased what he could and returned to the ship, ending up with mostly cattle, goats and chicken, but they did get a bit of cloth too. A similar scene played out in Machilipatnam a little further down the coast. They did the 18th century version of click and collect, where they had organised for a merchant to have all the goods ready for them so that all they had to do was pay, pick up and go. Turns out though, the French agent thought the St Jean Baptiste wouldn't be in town for a little while yet, so the goods they had ordered hadn't all arrived, and they weren't due to turn up for another month or so. De Surville, again, didn't have the time to wait around, and to add insult to injury, he wasn't happy with the quality of the cloth the agent had managed to get. Despite this, they purchased some more cattle, chickens and sheep for food. Next stop was Pondicherry on the 5th of May, having taken about 2 months sailing down the eastern coast of India from Chandernagore. This would be their final port before leaving India behind and getting properly underway. During these 2 months, Larbe was getting more and more concerned by the day, because by his assessment, they needed a lot more gear, things like ropes and sails. In fact, at this point in his journal, he says that had he not given his word, he would have ditched the expedition altogether. Because, quote, "the voyage has begun so badly that I am already weary," end quote. Just to reiterate, Larbe is the second in command of this expedition. They haven't even left India. The expedition is barely underway, and he's already thinking, this is going to be an absolute train wreck. That does not bode well. And in what is probably going to become the catchphrase of this story, it only got worse. The food was also inadequate, and this was of particular concern to the first lieutenant. Food on sailing ships at this time was pretty famously shit, and almost all of it was hard on your teeth or stomach. Hardtack, salted meat, wormy biscuit, fresh meat that had gone bad and was just thrown in a stew. Water became brackish, in this case probably because the roof was leaking. Additionally, the water could be contaminated with bacteria or creepy crawlies, so it had to be filtered through cloth, or alternatively, if you didn't have that, you just sucked it through your teeth. The rank-and-file crew had no option but to just grin and bear it. But the officers were afforded a few more luxuries on occasion. such as chicken, ham, sausages, and wine. L'Abbé's concern was that, as First Lieutenant, he was getting meals that were very much below the standard he expected, not even considering what the rest of the non-officer crew was getting. Meals were often the only time, other than sleeping, that the crew got to kinda hang out and not do any work. It was a brief respite in their very regimented and routine day that they savoured quite a lot. So, although L'Abbé was being a bit selfish, he did feel it was his duty to say something about the one bit of light during the day that they all got being ruined. He wrote in his journal, quote, "For a voyage of discovery as arduous as this is going to be, they have not even taken in stores of food for the officers, apart from hens and sheep. Open parentheses, but I am not counting on them, they are so quickly consumed and nearly all die, close parentheses. We should have butter, cheese, hams, but there is nothing of all that, not even any mustard or beans. It is pitiful. No dessert. We are served any old how. Those who have wine drink it, and yet the ship is supposed to supply the food." End quote. Why won't anyone think of the mustard, beans, and dessert? Again, it's important to keep in mind that they haven't even left India yet. The voyage hasn't really started. As they were in Pondicherry, Lauriston hosted the officers in the governor's palace. He was able to appease L'Abbé and the officers temporarily as he wined and dined them, giving them tours around the palace, where Indian gardeners watered lawns and flowers. De Surville also conferred with Lauriston alone for several hours, and when he came out, the governor showed off the amazing gifts he received from local princes, such as ivory statuettes and embroidered coats. At the end of their stay, Lauriston gave them a farewell dinner and toasted to their successful voyage in China, which no doubt was done with a bit of a wink-wink, nudge-nudge. This again concerned L'Abbé, because out of the probably 10 to 15 people there, he was one of the 3 people in the room who knew that wasn't where they were going, even if he didn't know what the destination was exactly. While this was all going on, the soldiers were brought onto the ship, having been waiting for them to arrive. With their final supplies loaded, and the officers no doubt feeling a bit happier having their bellies full of expensive food, they left Pondicherry on the 2nd of June 1769, heading to the southeast. They were out of sight of land not long after midday, and L'Abbé's final entry in his journal for that day was, quote, "God's will be done." End quote. The first week was mostly uneventful. L'Abbé would stand on the deck and look at the stars just before going to bed each night. One evening he was joined by Captain St Paul, the commanding officer of the Marines. He asked L'Abbé if he could smell land, because apparently the Marines had been rather seasick and were looking to get their feet back on firm soil, even if only for a bit. L'Abbé merely told him that they would, quote, "get used to it, though some, of course, are born into it," end quote. At this, he nodded towards Gabriel Leroux, a young boy checking the animal pens, who had been found as a stowaway on the second day of the expedition. He was from St Malo, just like L'Abbé, and had arrived in India on another ship. Apparently, some other sailor had told him that the St Jean Baptiste was heading back to France, and so he snuck on board. Unfortunately, he was caught, and de Surville threatened him with 20 lashes, but in the end decided to add him as a proper member of the crew, now doing odd jobs like cleaning the animal pens or swabbing the deck. While this conversation was going on, the moonlight revealed a distant shore, which the watchman called out the bearings of, prompting the men below deck to come out and look. Labe identified this as Great Nicobar, one of the islands just north of Sumatra. De Surville was concerned to hear this because he thought they shouldn't be this far east given his calculations, and ordered they slow their speed and wait until morning. The sun rose after a few hours, and De Surville decided that they should just head south and skip this one. Labe seems to have verbally agreed with this, probably making some sort of offhand comment about the fact that they didn't need supplies right now, since they'd already got them so recently. De Surville at this point seems to have started thinking out loud, because he retorted that he wasn't interested in supplies on the island, but a Danish settlement. This prompted Labe to look at De Surville with a confused expression, and say, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Well, maybe he didn't say that exactly, but this was news to Labe, who had never heard of any such settlement, or that it was part of their instructions to investigate it. Having realised his mistake, De Surville explained that they had heard rumours of a Danish settlement on the island, which, if true, was slightly concerning, because it meant that if France went to war with Denmark at some point, then they could use the settlement as a base to control one of the routes to the East Indies. Currently, they weren't on the correct side of the island where the settlement was said to be. They would need to go right around the coast if they wanted to find it, and that would take more time than De Surville was willing to give. So he decided to just not bother, instead letting the next ship investigate. Although this interaction wasn't super significant on its own, it did illustrate to Labe just how much he didn't know, and he likely wondered how many secret instructions De Surville had been given, along with how many of those would be revealed to anyone else other than the captain. There are secrets upon secrets upon secrets, and only one person seems to have all the information. The problem with this is that only one person can make all the decisions, and they better hope that that person knows what they're doing. De Surville has 172 souls in his care. They are all relying on him and almost him alone to make the right choices. Next time, with the voyage now properly underway, we will follow the St Jean Baptiste and her crew as they make their way into the Pacific. We will follow a little bit of the significant events that happened on board and what happened at the various places they stopped. It is admittedly going to take us some time to get back to Aotearoa, but as I have openly telegraphed, this story is going to go very much downhill, and I want to bring you along for the ride. If you want to get in touch, my email and social media is on historyaotearoa.com. Aotearoa spelt Aotearoa. You can also find helpful resources there, like transcripts and sources. If you would like to support Hans, you can do so through donating via Patreon or just giving us a review. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.